On the morning of July 17, 2020, Princess Beatrice walked into a church like someone sneaking into her own life. No balcony, no cheering crowd packed shoulder to shoulder outside Windsor, no long carriage ride where the nation gets to decide whether you look happy enough. Just a quiet ceremony during a year when the whole world felt like it had turned the volume down. And Beatrice, who had spent most of her adult life being treated like a punchline, showed up dressed like a plot twist. She wore one of the Queen's old gowns, not a new princess dress, not a designer flex, a dress with history baked into the fabric. She wore a hat that looked elegant instead of memed, and she looked calm in a way that confused people who were used to seeing her described as messy, loud, clumsy, or just unfortunate. For a brief moment, the press didn't know what to do with her. And if you're into documentaries that dig into the stuff people miss, you might want to subscribe, because this story gets stranger the further you pull on it. Because the Beatrice they'd sold to the public for years was the party princess, the awkward royal, the one with the strange hats, the one who was always somewhere in the background when a more important royal entered the room. The kind of person tabloids treat like a toy, wind her up, watch her stumble, laugh, repeat. But here she was, getting married in near silence, in borrowed clothes, in a ceremony that felt less like a performance and more like an escape. And if you're wondering why that matters, it's because Beatrice's whole life has been shaped by one brutal truth. She didn't just inherit a title, she inherited a mood. And the mood around her family, the Yorks, has been complicated for so long that people began judging her before she even did anything. Which raises the real question, was Beatrice ever actually a problem princess, or was she just the easiest target in a family that kept handing the public fresh reasons to point and stare? To understand how she ended up choosing a life that's almost designed to avoid headlines, you have to start with the part of her story most people skip, the little girl who couldn't read the way everyone expected her to. And that leads to the first thing Beatrice had to learn early, how to look fine while struggling in plain sight.
When people imagine royal childhoods, they picture soft, focused scenes, ponies, castles, a smiling nanny, maybe a golden retriever sprinting across a lawn the size of a small town. They don't picture a child staring at words that won't behave. Beatrice has spoken about having dyslexia and how it made school feel like being asked to run a race with your shoelaces tied together. The cruel part is that dyslexia doesn't always look dramatic from the outside. A kid isn't necessarily disruptive. They might just go quiet. They might get labeled slow or careless when they're actually working twice as hard just to keep up. Now add the royal layer. Because in a normal family, a child struggling in school is just a child struggling in school. In a royal family, everything becomes symbolic. The public doesn't see a kid who needs support. They see the future of the monarchy, and they start scoring you like a product. Beatrice wasn't the heir. She wasn't even close. But that didn't mean the expectations were low. It meant the expectations were weird. She was supposed to be impressive, but not too impressive, visible, but not loud, charming, but never chaotic, and above all, she was supposed to make the family look stable. That's a hard job for anyone. It's even harder when you're fighting your own brain just to finish homework. And if you've ever had to deal with dyslexia, you know the deeper problem isn't just reading, it's confidence. It's the quiet fear that everyone else got handed an instruction manual you never received. It's being underestimated so often that you start speaking smaller so nobody notices when you don't know the answer. Beatrice learned early how to smile through that feeling, which is a useful skill, right up until people start assuming the smile is the whole personality. Because while she was dealing with something real behind the scenes, the public story forming around her was something much simpler and much meaner, a privileged earl who didn't seem to be doing much at all. And once that story takes hold, it doesn't matter what you actually do. the world will keep reading you the way it wants to read you. And that brings us to the version of Beatrice most people think they know, the one that tabloids basically built from scratch. There's a particular kind of British tabloid character that gets created when the press doesn't know what else to do with you. If you're the heir, they treat you like a monument. If you're the rebel, they treat you like a headline machine. But if you're somewhere in the middle, royal enough to be interesting, not important enough to be protected, you become a canvas. And Beatrice became a canvas. In the 2000s, she and her sister Eugenie were photographed at clubs, parties, social events, exactly the kinds of places wealthy young people go when they're trying to have a normal youth inside a very abnormal life. But when you're royal, going out doesn't stay small. It becomes a label. Soon it wasn't Beatrice went to a party, it was Beatrice is a party. And once you've been stamped with that, everything gets filtered through it. A normal 20-something learns in public by being messy in private. A royal 20-something learns in public while strangers keep score. If you look tired, it's proof you were out late. If you look happy, it's proof you don't take duty seriously. If you dress badly, it's proof you're ridiculous. If you dress well, it's proof you're wasting money. The party princess narrative also did something sneakier. It made her easy to dismiss. Because if the public can reduce you to a party photo, they don't have to consider the deeper stuff, like what it's like to grow up with parents whose drama is national entertainment, or how it feels to be a royal who isn't given a clear job. And then there was the style thing. Beatrice became famous for hats the way some people become famous for tripping on the sidewalk, not because it's important, but because it's easy to laugh at. Her outfits were treated like comedy, and comedy is powerful. Comedy turns a person into an object. Once someone becomes a joke, people feel entitled to them. But here's what gets missed. Beatrice didn't seem like someone trying to be outrageous. She seemed like someone trying to figure it out, trying to pick a lane between tradition and modern life, between royal correctness and having a personality. And every time she tried, the internet acted like it was a personal gift. That's how a public identity gets built, one unflattering photo at a time, until the person inside the photos stops mattering. But all of that, the parties, the hats, the jokes, was still surface level compared to what was coming, because there was a storm gathering over her family name that would follow her everywhere, even when she did nothing at all. And that storm had a very specific shape: her father.
There are some last names that feel like a door opening, and there are last names that feel like a hand on your shoulder holding you back. For Beatrice, York became the second kind. Prince Andrew spent years as a royal with a certain swagger, military titles, official trips, the confidence of someone who had never had to be normal for even one afternoon. But over time, his public image didn't just crack, it became radioactive. His friendships, his choices, the interviews that made people stare at the screen like they couldn't believe what they were hearing, the allegations that followed him like a shadow you couldn't step out of, the kind of controversy where even mentioning the details starts to feel like stepping into a mud puddle you can't wash off. And here's the thing about family scandals. The public doesn't treat them like they're contained. They spread. Beatrice didn't choose her father's behavior. She didn't schedule his TV appearance. She didn't build his social circle. But she carried the consequences anyway, because that's what happens when your identity is tied to a public institution. People started looking at her like she was part of the problem just for sharing his DNA. Every public appearance became complicated. Every smiling photo became suspicious. Every attempt at normal life got dragged back into the same conversation she didn't create. And behind the scenes, the practical effects were real. A royal scandal doesn't just hurt feelings. It changes who returns your calls. It changes what brands want to be near you. It changes what events invite you.
It changes whether your charitable work gets taken seriously or treated like window dressing. It changes whether people assume you're kind or complicit. At the exact time Beatrice might have tried to become a more public royal, more duties, more visibility, more officialness, the ground under her family was turning into quicksand. So she did something that looks boring on paper, but is actually pretty strategic. She stepped sideways. Not in a dramatic, tell-all interview kind of way, not in a storm out of the palace kind of way, in a quiet, almost corporate way. She built a life where she didn't need the public to clap for her to exist. And the reason that matters is because it's the opposite of what people assume about royals. Most people think they chase attention like oxygen. Beatrice started designing her life like someone trying to breathe without it. But to see how deliberate that was, you have to look at what she chose instead of the spotlight, because it wasn't laziness, and it wasn't hiding. It was a different kind of ambition.
There's a stereotype about royals who aren't full-time working royals. They're imagined as floating around, charity galas, fancy lunches, vague projects with vague titles, living on a kind of permanent weekend. Beatrice quietly tried to do something that doesn't photograph well. She built a career, not a ceremonial job, real employment with bosses and expectations and the risk of failing without it being spun into a national tragedy. Over the years, she took on roles in the private sector, including work connected to business and tech. And whether you think that's glamorous or not, the key point is this: she wasn't trying to become famous. She was trying to become useful in a way that didn't depend on royal sparkle. That's a very different posture than the one the public expects, because the traditional royal path is visibility. You serve, you attend, you're photographed, shaking hands. Your value is measured in how you represent the institution. Beatrice's version of adulthood looked more like learn skills, keep your head down, do the work, go home. Which sounds simple until you remember who she is. Try being a princess in an office. Try being the person everyone knows about while also trying to be treated like everyone else. Try having colleagues who pretend they don't care while also having strangers online tracking your outfit budget like it's a crime report. A private career doesn't just give you income, it gives you something royals often lack, a self that exists outside the family story. And for Beatrice, that mattered because the family story kept getting uglier, louder, and harder to outrun. A normal person can change cities, change jobs, change their name on social media. A princess can't. So instead, she changed the only thing she could truly control, how much of herself she handed over to the public. And the next part of her story is where you can see that shift most clearly, not in a boardroom, but in the way she rebuilt her image so quietly that people only noticed after it worked.
Beatrice's public image used to feel like it was always one bad photo away from becoming a joke again. And then, slowly, that stopped happening. Not because the internet got kinder, it didn't. Not because she suddenly became someone else, but because she got smarter about the game she was being forced to play. Her wedding was a turning point, not because weddings are magical, but because it was the first time in a long time that she seemed to be setting the terms. Small guest list, low noise, no grand performance. And there was something else, the clothes. It's easy to laugh at royal fashion coverage, but style is a kind of language in that world. Beatrice wearing a dress borrowed from the Queen wasn't just vintage, it was a message. I'm connected to tradition, I respect the institution, and I don't need to scream for attention. It was also, frankly, a smart move, because the public had spent years framing her as wasteful, silly, unserious. Showing up in something reused and historic made it harder to run the old script. And then came the rest of the reinvention. Fewer public outings, fewer messy narratives, a calmer presence, a sense that she wasn't auditioning to be liked anymore. She also found a different kind of stability in her personal life. Her marriage to Edoardo Mapellimazzi brought her into a setup that felt less like tabloid theater and more like adulthood.
not a fairy tale, something more practical. A life that includes step-parenting, private routines, and responsibilities that don't come with a press release. This is the part people don't always understand. Reinvention doesn't have to be loud. Sometimes reinvention is just refusing to give the public new material, and Beatrice became very good at that. But there's a catch, because staying private as a royal isn't just a lifestyle choice, it's a negotiation with an institution built on visibility. And the most controversial part of Beatrice's story isn't her hats or her party photos or even her career. It's her loyalty, because she kept showing up for her family even when the public was begging her not to. And that brings us to the tightrope she's been walking for years. How do you keep your private life private when your last name is a public argument?
If you want to understand Beatrice, you have to understand what she is not. She is not the future king. That's William's lane, a life built around training, restraint, and the slow-motion weight of inheritance. And she is not the runaway royal. That's Harry's lane, a life built around escape velocity, reinvention by confession, and constant cultural debate. Beatrice's lane is stranger. She's royal enough to be watched, but not royal enough to be shielded, important enough to be blamed, but not important enough to control the story. So she chose the third option, controlled obscurity. It's not accidental that she avoids headlines. It's a strategy. Because headlines have never been kind to her, and she has watched, front row, what fame does to a family. She watched what happened to her mother when tabloid culture turned personal mistakes into a national sport. And later, she watched what happened when her father's controversies became so big they started swallowing everyone nearby. In that environment, keeping your head down isn't weakness, it's survival. But the loyalty part is where it gets really complicated. Beatrice didn't publicly exile her father. She didn't do a big moral performance. She didn't turn family pain into content. And in a modern media climate, that makes people suspicious. Because the internet often wants clear villains and clear heroes. It wants clean splits. It wants people to announce loudly that they are on the right side. Real families don't work like that. In real life, people can love someone and still be disappointed in them. They can stay loyal without being blind. They can support privately without defending publicly. And they can refuse to make their family's worst moments into their own brand. Beatrice's approach seems to be, I will live my life. I will work. I will show up when I have to. I will protect what I can, and I will not feed the machine. That choice comes with a price, because the public often punishes silence. Silence gets interpreted as approval or cowardice or guilt. But silence can also be a boundary, a way of saying, you don't get all of me. And the longer you watch Beatrice, the more it becomes clear that her low-profile life isn't what happens when a royal fails at being famous. It's what happens when a royal decides fame is a bad deal. She doesn't want the William package, duty as identity, with your whole personality flattened into future monarch. And she doesn't want the Harry package, global spotlight, where every sentence becomes an international argument. She wants something smaller and sturdier, a family, a job, a private home life, and just enough public presence to stay legitimate without becoming a daily target. It's not glamorous, it's not dramatic, it's not great for tabloids, which is exactly why it might be the smartest royal strategy of all. And once you see it that way, Beatrice's story stops being the awkward princess who got laughed at. It becomes the story of someone who got laughed at and quietly built an exit route.
Princess Beatrice wasn't born as the star of the royal story. She was born into the margins of it, close enough to be photographed, far enough to be disposable. She grew up with dyslexia in a world that treats struggle like weakness.
She got branded as a party princess in a media culture that loves simple characters. And she spent her adulthood living under a cloud she didn't create, as her father's scandals turned her family name into something people said with a grimace. But the part of her story people miss is the part that doesn't make noise. She didn't fix her reputation with a big speech. She didn't win the public over by demanding attention. She did it by shrinking the target. She built a career outside the royal spotlight. She reinvented herself without announcing it. She kept her life private on purpose, and she stayed loyal in the way real people are loyal: messy, quiet, complicated, and mostly off-camera. In a family where every emotion can become a headline, Beatrice's most radical move was choosing to be boring to strangers. Not because she had nothing to offer, but because she finally understood the one thing the tabloids never wanted her to learn. A princess doesn't have to perform to exist.